The sound of the hammer had a rhythm to it, a terrible, precise cadence that has echoed in the quietest corners of my memory for nearly 60 years. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 heavy, deliberate blows. It's the sound that became the metronome for my darkest nightmares, the beat that underscored the end of one life and the beginning of another. Hello. My name is Isabel, and I am 83 years old now. I've lived long enough to see the world change in ways I never could have imagined, to watch seasons turn into decades, and to learn that life, for all its beauty, can hold sorrows as deep as any ocean. My journey has been long, sometimes sweet as honeycomb fresh from the hive, other times as bitter as gall. But through it all, there is one story I have never truly told, not in its entirety. It's a story I buried deep within my heart, hidden away like those old photographs that turn yellow and brittle in a forgotten drawer. Today, I feel it's time. Time to unlock that drawer and let the light in, no matter how much it hurts. It's funny how a single sound can hold a whole lifetime within it, isn't it? I sometimes wonder if any of you have a sound like that, one that takes you right back to a moment you'd just as soon forget. My story begins in the summer of 1968. I was only 26, but in the way of young women of that time, I felt I had my whole life settled. I lived in a small, peaceful town in the heart of the country, a place where everyone knew your name, and the rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons. The hills rolled out like a soft green quilt under the hot July sun. The oak trees danced in the gentle breeze, and the air was filled with the sweet perfume of my mother's rose bushes and the smell of freshly cut grass. It was a simple life, a good life, or so I believed. I had been married for 3 years to Paul. In our little town, Paul was more than just a man. He was an institution. He was a woodworker, but calling him that feels like calling a great painter a house painter. His hands were considered golden, touched by a gift. He had a small, dusty workshop on Main Street, and from it he created pieces of furniture so beautiful, so intricately crafted, that families from the big city would drive for hours just to commission a dining table or a cradle from him. He could make wood sing. Everyone respected him. He was quiet, hard-working, and dependable, the kind of man any father would be proud to have his daughter marry. We'd met at a 4th of July town picnic a few years earlier. My mother and I were selling slices of her famous apple pie at the church ladies' booth. He'd come over, looking a little shy, and bought a whole pie. He told me it was for his mother, who was feeling poorly and loved a good apple pie more than anything. His voice was gentle, and there was a kindness in his eyes that made my heart flutter. It was only years later, after the wedding, after the life we built had begun to crack at the seams, that I discovered his mother had passed away when he was just a boy. He'd never even known her apple pie. But that was just the first of many lies. The first loose thread in a tapestry I didn't yet know was woven from deception. Our courtship was brief, as was the custom. In those days, when a respectable man with a good trade showed interest in a girl, the families met, and decisions were made swiftly. Paul was 10 years my senior, a significant gap that at the time seemed to promise stability and maturity. He owned his own small house, left to him by his father, and had his successful business. My own father, a hard-working farmer with 6 children to feed and a constant worry etched into his brow, saw in Paul a provider, a safe harbor for his eldest daughter. He gave his blessing without a moment's hesitation, and just like that, my future was decided. The first couple of years of our marriage were serene, almost idyllic. Paul was a man of few words, but his actions seemed to speak of a gentle nature. He would leave small gifts for me on the kitchen table, a ribbon for my hair he'd picked up at the general store, a small wildflower he'd plucked on his walk home, a warm pastry from the town bakery. Our house was small but cozy, with a porch swing out front and a little garden in the back where I grew tomatoes, basil, and cheerful zinnias. We had a small covered patio where we'd eat dinner on warm summer evenings, watching the fireflies begin their silent, blinking dance as the stars pricked the deep velvet sky. I felt content. I felt safe. I believed I was living the life every girl in our town dreamed of. I was Mrs. Paul, the respected woodworker's wife. The changes began subtly, seeping into our quiet life like a slow, cold fog during the winter of our second year. It started with the drinking. At first, it was just an extra glass of wine with dinner, then two. Soon, it was an entire bottle, consumed in silence. When he drank, he didn't become loud or aggressive. He became something far more unnerving, a hollow man. He would sit at the dinner table, staring at the wall, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. It was as if he were looking into a terrible memory, a private horror movie playing only for him. The silence in the house grew heavy, thick with unspoken things. "What is it, Paul?" I'd ask, my voice sounding small and fragile in the oppressive quiet. "Is something wrong at the shop? Can I help?" He would just shake his head slowly, a barely perceptible motion, before pushing his chair back and heading off to bed, leaving me alone with the dirty dishes and a heart full of a nameless dread. I'd lie awake for hours, listening to his heavy, troubled breathing, wondering what demons were wrestling in his mind and why he wouldn't let me in. I told myself it was just stress, the pressure of his work, the burden of being the sole provider. I made excuses for him, to myself and to others. I protected the perfect image of our marriage, polishing it for the world to see, even as the tarnish was spreading on the inside. Then came that spring, the season of rebirth, of new beginnings. For us, it was the beginning of the end. Paul came home one afternoon with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was a manic energy, a feverish excitement that burned in his eyes. It was a stark contrast to the months of sullen silence. "Isabel," he said, his voice unusually animated, "I've decided to do some work on the house." "What kind of work?" I asked, surprised but hopeful. Maybe this was it. Maybe he'd found a new passion that would pull him out of his darkness. "I'm going to fix up the basement," he announced. "I'm going to build a proper workshop down there. A private one where I can work on my own projects, even at night." Our basement was a small, damp space, smelling of earth and mildew. It was little more than a cellar, used for storing my canned vegetables, old jars, and the preserves my mother sent over. The thought of it becoming a woodworker's shop seemed impossible. It was dark, cramped, and the air was always heavy and cold. But I saw the spark in his eyes, the first real enthusiasm he'd shown in a year, and my heart lifted. Maybe this was what he needed, a project to pour his energy into, something to be proud of. "That's a wonderful idea," I said, my voice full of genuine relief. "When do you want to start?" "Tomorrow," he said, the word sharp and final. "I've already ordered all the materials." The very next day, a large flatbed truck rumbled to a stop in front of our little house, its engine disturbing the quiet afternoon. Two men began to unload a mountain of supplies, stacks of thick wooden planks, heavy bags of cement, and boxes of new, gleaming tools. And then they unloaded something else, something that caught my eye and sent a small, inexplicable shiver down my spine. They were large, dark gray panels made of a thick, spongy material I'd never seen before. "What are those for?" I asked Paul, who was directing the workers with a focused intensity I'd only ever seen him apply to his most intricate woodworking. "Acoustic insulation," he replied, without turning to look at me. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "Soundproofing, so I don't disturb the neighbors when I'm working late at night." I nodded, accepting the explanation. It made sense, and yet it didn't. Our nearest neighbor was Mrs. Henderson, and her house was a good 100 yards away, separated by a thick stand of trees. She was half-deaf as it was, but Paul had always been a precise man, meticulous in his planning. I chalked it up to his perfectionism and went back inside, trying to ignore the little seed of unease that had been planted in my mind. The work began that very afternoon. Paul had told his assistant he was taking a month-long holiday, something he had never done before. He was dedicating himself entirely to this basement project. At first, I truly thought it was a blessing. He had a purpose again. The drinking stopped completely. His mind was sharp, focused, consumed by his new goal. He was creating something, and for a man like Paul, creation was everything. It was during that first week that I began to notice the rhythm, the peculiar, unvarying rhythm of his hammering. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 heavy, solid blows. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. It was methodical, almost hypnotic. At first, I paid it no mind. It was just the sound of a man at work. But as the days bled into one another, that sound became the constant, oppressive soundtrack of our home. It echoed up through the floorboards, a relentless heartbeat that started at dawn and often didn't stop until long after I had gone to bed. Paul worked with a terrifying stamina. He barely stopped to eat. He'd come upstairs, his face smudged with sawdust and sweat, wolf down the lunch I'd prepared, and then disappear back down the creaking wooden stairs to the basement. He wouldn't allow me to go down, not even for a peek. "It's a surprise, Isabel," he'd say, and he'd try to smile, but the smile never reached his eyes. Those eyes held a gleam that looked less like creative passion and more like obsession. "You'll see it when it's all finished." The weeks crawled by, each day marked by the same relentless rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. I began to feel like a prisoner in my own home, my only companion the constant, disembodied sound of my husband's labor. I noticed other changes, too. He started talking to himself downstairs. I couldn't make out the words, just a low, angry murmur that would rise and fall between the blows of the hammer. I was becoming more and more isolated, more and more afraid, but I didn't know who to talk to. How could I explain this vague, formless fear to anyone? That my husband was working too hard? That his hammering had a strange rhythm? People would think I was a fool, or worse, an ungrateful wife. One evening, nearly a month after he had started, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I realized the hammering had stopped. The sudden absolute silence was more jarring than the noise had been. It felt heavy, unnatural, as if the whole world were holding its breath. I waited for a few minutes, expecting the rhythm to start up again, but the house remained eerily still. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the basement door. "Paul?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Is everything all right down there?" There was no answer. My heart began to beat a frantic rhythm of its own. I knocked lightly on the thick wooden door. "Paul? Dinner's almost ready." The door was suddenly wrenched open from the other side, making me jump back with a gasp. Paul stood there, framed in the dim light of the stairwell. His clothes were covered in sawdust, his hair was matted with sweat, but it was his eyes that truly frightened me. They were shining with a wild, triumphant light. "It's finished," he said, his voice a low, guttural whisper. He stepped aside. "Do you want to see it?" I hesitated. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house. A cold dread, thick and suffocating, settled over me, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the look on his face, by the unspoken command in his eyes. I gave a small, jerky nod. The knot in my stomach tightened until I could barely breathe. I followed him down the steep, narrow stairs. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was an overpowering mixture of freshly cut pine, varnish, and something else. Something I couldn't place. A sharp, metallic, almost chemical odor that pricked at the back of my throat. The basement was utterly transformed. He had built a room inside the room. a large windowless box constructed of thick wooden planks, its walls lined with the same dark, spongy soundproofing material I had seen the delivery men unload weeks ago. It was a stark, ugly structure that seemed to suck all the light and air out of the cellar. "It's completely soundproof," Paul explained, his voice swelling with a disturbing pride. He ran a hand over the padded wall. "No sound gets in, and no sound gets out." In the center of the room stood a heavy, solid workbench, its surface smooth and newly finished. On the walls, his woodworking tools were arranged with surgical precision: saws, chisels, planes, all gleaming under the single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. But my eyes were drawn to something else. My gaze locked onto the door of this new interior room. It wasn't made of wood. It was a thick, heavy slab of metal, painted a dull gray. And the lock, it wasn't a simple handle or a deadbolt. It was a complex mechanism with a large wheel and multiple bolts, the kind of thing you'd see on a bank vault or a butcher's freezer. "Why such a heavy door?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, to pretend this was all perfectly normal. "To protect my tools," Paul answered immediately, his gaze fixed on the wall above my head. "Some of them are very valuable, custom-made." I nodded slowly, even though I knew every tool he owned, and none of them were so precious as to require a vault door. My eyes scanned the room, desperately searching for something that made sense, but everything seemed slightly wrong, slightly skewed from reality. I noticed a small circular opening, no bigger than a dinner plate, covered by a metal grill near the ceiling of the box. "And what's that?" I asked, pointing. "A ventilation duct," he explained smoothly, "for air circulation. Sawdust can be bad for the lungs if you breathe too much of it." Everything had a logical explanation. A perfectly reasonable answer. And yet, the feeling of profound wrongness wouldn't leave me. This wasn't a craftsman's workshop. This was something else. This was something that had been designed with a terrible, meticulous purpose in mind. "Do you like it?" Paul asked again, turning to face me fully. He was watching my face, studying my reaction with an unnerving intensity. "It's impressive," I managed to say, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "You've done an amazing job." A slow smile spread across his face. It was a smile I had never seen before. It wasn't warm or affectionate. It wasn't the smile of the shy man who had bought my apple pie. It was the cold, satisfied smile of a hunter who has finally completed the perfect trap. "I'm glad you think so," he said softly. "I'll start on my first real project in here tomorrow." That night, I didn't sleep. I lay perfectly still in our bed, listening to the sound of his breathing beside me, and all I could see when I closed my eyes was that room, that cold, silent, soundproof box in our basement. I thought of the heavy metal door, the tiny ventilation duct, and the chilling, triumphant smile on my husband's face, and I knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins, that his first project had nothing to do with wood. The following morning, I woke before the sun, emerging from a shallow, dreamless sleep that had offered no rest. A heavy blanket of dread had settled over me during the night, so thick I felt I could barely breathe. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of leaves outside the window, sent a jolt of pure terror through me. Paul was still asleep beside me, his breathing even and deep, the picture of peaceful slumber. It was a horrifying contrast to the monstrous reality I now knew was coiled beneath his calm exterior. The image of that room in the basement, that cold, soundproof box, was burned into my mind. It was a tomb waiting for the living. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and crept downstairs to the kitchen. I moved on autopilot, starting the coffee percolator, my hands shaking so violently that the grounds spilled across the countertop. My mind was a whirlwind of frantic, disjointed thoughts. I have to leave. I have to get out of this house. But where would I go? Back to my parents? My father revered Paul. He would never believe such a monstrous story. He would think I was hysterical, an ungrateful wife making up insane fantasies. He would probably send me right back, telling me to apologize to my husband and be sensible. The police? What would I tell them? That my husband had built a workshop in the basement? That I had a bad feeling about it? They would laugh me out of the station. I had no proof, nothing but my own gut-wrenching fear. As the coffee began to bubble, a new thought, cold and sharp, cut through my panic. The project, his first project. He had said he would start today. What did that mean? What did he have planned? I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I couldn't wait to find out. I had to know what was in his mind. He had mentioned needing to go into town that morning, to pick up a few special materials. That was my chance. A small window of time to find something, anything, that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. An hour later, Paul came down for breakfast. He was cheerful, humming a tune I didn't recognize. He kissed my cheek as he passed, a gesture so normal it felt obscene. "Morning, honey," he said, sitting down at the table. "Smells good. Is that a fresh pot?" I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. I placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, my movement stiff and robotic. He ate with a healthy appetite, talking about the weather, about a customer who was late on a payment. It was the most normal conversation we'd had in months, and it was the most terrifying experience of my life. It was like having breakfast with a stranger who was wearing my husband's face. "Well, I'm off," he said, pushing his chair back. "Got to run into town to pick up a few things for the new workshop. I'll be back for lunch." He paused at the door and smiled at me. "Don't you go peeking downstairs. I want my first creation in the new space to be a surprise for you too." The word creation hung in the air like a poisonous vapor. I watched from the window as his car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the road. The moment it was out of sight, I flew into action. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to search. I started in his chest of drawers, rummaging through his neatly folded shirts and socks, my heart pounding against my ribs. Nothing. I checked the pockets of his work coats hanging by the door. Nothing but sawdust and a few loose screws. My mind was racing. Where would he keep his secrets? He was a meticulous, organized man. Everything had its place. I ran upstairs to our bedroom, my eyes scanning every surface. The top of his dresser held only a wooden valet for his keys and loose change. The closet was just clothes. Then my eyes fell on his bedside table. A simple, one-drawer table he had made himself. It was the one place that was exclusively his. With trembling hands, I pulled the small wooden knob. The drawer slid open smoothly. Inside, there was nothing but a half-read book on furniture design and a pair of reading glasses. My heart sank. I was wrong. There was nothing. Maybe I was going crazy. I started to close the drawer, defeated, when my fingers brushed against something beneath the book. I pushed the book aside. Tucked away at the back of the drawer was a small, leather-bound notebook. I had never seen it before. It wasn't one of the large sketch pads he used for his furniture designs. This was small, private. My breath caught in my throat. I lifted it out. It felt cold in my hands. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it to the first page. What I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. They were not drawings of chairs or tables. They were architectural sketches, detailed and precise, of the room in the basement. But these drawings included horrifying details that I hadn't seen, details that he had yet to install. There were thick leather straps bolted to the top of the workbench, heavy iron rings affixed to the walls. And then there were the other sketches on the following pages, drawings of tools. But they were not the tools of a woodworker. They were sharp, cruel-looking implements I couldn't identify, things that seemed designed for only one purpose, to inflict pain. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages. The pages that followed were filled not with drawings, but with his handwriting. It was a tight, angry script, a frantic scrawl of fragmented thoughts and declarations. Words jumped out at me, each one a blow to my soul. Discipline is the only way. She must be taught to respect. Control is everything. And then I saw my name, written over and over again, circled, underlined. Isabel needs to learn her place. Isabel will be perfect after the lessons. Isabel will not leave. The room will make sure of that. I slammed the notebook shut, a strangled sob escaping my lips. It was all there, a detailed blueprint for my own personal hell. The weeks of obsessive hammering, the soundproof walls, the vault door, the ventilation duct. It wasn't a workshop. It was a prison, a torture chamber, and it had been designed meticulously and lovingly for me. In that horrifying moment of clarity, I heard a sound from outside that shattered my trance, the crunch of tires on our gravel driveway. No, it can't be. I scrambled to the window and peered out. Paul's car was pulling up to the house. He was back. It hadn't even been an hour. He must have forgotten something. Or maybe he knew. Maybe he'd been testing me. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I shoved the notebook back into the drawer, under the book, arranging it exactly as I had found it. I slid the drawer shut and flew down the stairs, my mind screaming. I had to act normal. If he suspected I knew, I didn't dare to imagine what would happen. I was in the kitchen, frantically washing a coffee cup that was already clean, when he walked in. He was smiling, but his eyes were as cold and flat as river stones. "Forgot my wallet," he said, tapping his back pocket. "Getting old." He walked past me, up the stairs. I stood frozen, listening to his footsteps overhead, directly above me, in our bedroom. I heard the bedside drawer open. A pause. Then I heard it close. My heart stopped. Did he see? Did he know I'd moved it? He came back down the stairs, wallet in hand, still smiling that terrible, empty smile. "All right, off for real this time," he said. He didn't come near me. He just watched me for a moment, his head tilted slightly, as if I were a puzzle he was trying to solve. Then he turned and left. I didn't move until I heard his car drive away a second time. I collapsed against the counter, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. I had to get out. I had to get out now. But as I looked around my small, cozy kitchen, a paralyzing fear took hold. He would come back, and he would find me. This was a small town. Where could I possibly go where he wouldn't think to look? He returned just before noon, carrying a couple of heavy canvas bags. He dropped them on the kitchen table with a dull thud. "I found everything I needed," he announced, his eyes gleaming with that same manic energy from before. "We can start right away." "Start what?" I asked, my voice a weak whisper. "My project," he said, his smile widening. He stepped towards me. "And I need your help. Come on down with me." "No." The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. His smile vanished. "What did you say?" I have to finish getting lunch ready," I stammered, backing away. He closed the distance between us in 2 strides and grabbed my arm. His grip wasn't just firm. It was a vice. Pain shot up to my shoulder. "Lunch can wait," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "This is more important." He began to pull me towards the basement door. My mind was screaming. This was it. If I went down those stairs, into that box, I would never come out again. I would be one of those women you hear about, who just vanishes one day without a trace. I dug my heels in, trying to fight, but he was so much stronger than me. The man whose strength I had once admired as he worked with heavy oak beams was now using that same strength to drag me to my doom. As he fumbled with the latch on the basement door, his back to me for a split second, my desperate mind grasped for a lifeline, any lie, any excuse that could stop this. And then an idea born of pure animal terror burst into my head. "Paul, wait," I cried out. There's something I have to tell you first." He paused, his hand on the door, and turned to look at me with unconcealed annoyance. "What?" My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I'm pregnant." The words fell into the tense silence of the kitchen like stones into a still pond. I watched his face, praying for the reaction I hoped for. Shock, maybe even a moment of softness that would make him pause whatever monstrous plan he had. For a second, it seemed to work. His grip on my arm loosened slightly. His eyes widened, his face a mask of confusion. What did you say?" "I'm pregnant," I repeated, trying to inject a note of fragile joy into my voice. "I just found out this morning. I was going to tell you tonight, as a surprise, but—" He stared at me, his expression unreadable. He wasn't calming down. He seemed to be processing, calculating, and then his face, which had been confused, twisted into a mask of pure fury. It was a rage more terrifying than anything I had ever seen. "You're lying!" he snarled, his grip tightening again, his knuckles white. He shoved me hard, and my back slammed against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me. "You're trying to manipulate me. You think I'm a fool? You think a lie like that can stop this?" "No, Paul, it's the truth," I gasped, tears of pain and terror streaming down my face. "We can go to the doctor tomorrow. He'll tell you." "Liar!" he roared, his face contorted. He raised his hand, and for the first time in our marriage, the man I thought I knew, the gentle, quiet craftsman, struck me. His open palm connected with my cheek with a sickening crack. My head snapped to the side, and the world exploded in a shower of white stars. In that moment, I understood. The man I had married had never really existed. He was a performance, a carefully constructed facade designed to hide the monster that had been there all along. "You will learn not to lie to me," he whispered, his voice shaking with rage. He grabbed a fistful of my hair and began to drag me again towards the basement door. "And your lessons are about to begin." My mind went blank with terror. This was the end. There was no escape. And then, through the fog of my pain and fear, I heard a sound so simple and ordinary it felt like a miracle from heaven. Knock, knock, knock. Someone was at the front door. Paul froze instantly, his hand still tangled in my hair. I held my breath, not daring to move, not daring to hope. "Who is it?" Paul called out, his voice tight and strained, but he did not release me. "It's just me, Dorothy," a cheerful, familiar voice called from the porch. "I brought you kids one of my peach pies." Dorothy. Our neighbor from down the road. A widow in her 70s, she was a kind soul who sometimes brought us vegetables from her garden or a freshly baked treat. She didn't visit often, but today her timing felt like divine intervention. Paul looked down at me, his eyes burning with a murderous fire. "Not one word," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "You smile and you act normal. If you try anything at all, I will hurt you. And then I will hurt her." He let go of my hair and gave me a little shove towards the sink. "Fix yourself," he commanded. I frantically tried to smooth my hair and wipe the tears from my face, my cheek already starting to throb and swell. Paul took a deep breath, and the monster vanished. In its place was the charming, friendly woodworker the whole town knew and loved. He opened the front door, a wide, welcoming smile on his face. "Dorothy! What a wonderful surprise! Please come in." Dorothy stepped into our kitchen, holding a beautiful pie with a golden lattice crust top. She was a woman whose gentle appearance belied a pair of eyes as sharp as a hawk's. Those eyes took in the scene in an instant. They flickered from Paul's overly bright smile to my face, to the red mark already blooming on my cheek, to the way I was standing stiffly by the counter, my hands clenched into fists. "Good morning, Paul. Hello, Isabel, dear," she said, her warm voice a balm on my raw nerves. She set the pie on the table. "These peaches were just perfect this morning. I couldn't resist. I thought you could enjoy it for dessert tonight." "Thank you, Dorothy. That's so kind of you," I said, my voice hoarse and shaky. I reached for the pie, and my hands trembled so much I was afraid I would drop it. Dorothy didn't take her eyes off me. It was an intense, questioning gaze. She knew. She didn't know what, but she knew something was deeply, terribly wrong. She turned her attention back to Paul. "Been busy, Paul?" "I haven't seen much of you folks lately," she said casually. "Though I suppose I've heard you. Sounded like you were building a whole new house down there in your basement with all that hammering." "Just fixing up a workshop for myself," Paul replied with a tight, forced laugh. "A man needs his space, you know." "Oh, that's lovely," Dorothy said, but her eyes were serious. "You'll have to show me when it's all done." Of course," Paul said, already trying to edge her towards the door. "Well, we won't keep you. We were just about to sit down for a late lunch." "Oh, don't mind me," Dorothy said, not moving an inch. She turned back to me, her expression full of a carefully masked concern. "Actually, Isabel, I was hoping I could borrow you tomorrow. My canning season is in full swing, and I have bushels of tomatoes to get through. These old hands just aren't what they used to be." It was a lifeline, a bright, shining rope thrown into the dark pit I was falling into. Before I could even open my mouth to accept, Paul cut in smoothly. "Oh, that's a shame, Dorothy, but Isabel will be busy tomorrow. She's promised to help me organize my new workshop." "I see," Dorothy said, and she locked her gaze with mine. There was a message in her eyes, a silent, urgent communication passing between us. "Don't give up. I'm trying to help you." "Well," she pressed on, not looking away from me. "What about the day after, dear? Surely you won't still be organizing then." I understood. This was my chance, my only chance. I had to take it. "The day after would be fine," I said, the words rushing out of me before Paul could speak again. "I'd be happy to help. I'll come over first thing in the morning." I saw a flash of pure fury in Paul's eyes, but he was trapped. He couldn't refuse a second time in front of his kindly old neighbor without looking like a controlling brute. He forced another tight smile. "Wonderful. Isabel is always so helpful." "That's settled then," Dorothy said, finally smiling a real smile. She patted my arm gently, a small, reassuring squeeze. "I'll expect you. Now I'll let you two have your lunch. Enjoy the pie." She gave me one last, significant look, a look that said, "Be strong," and then she was gone. The instant the front door clicked shut, Paul spun on me. The charming facade evaporated, and the monster was back. He grabbed me by my upper arms, his fingers digging into my flesh like claws. "You are not going anywhere the day after tomorrow," he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "You are not leaving this house again. Ever. Do you understand me?" "But Paul, she'll get suspicious if I don't show up," I pleaded, my mind racing. Hope and terror were at war within me. Dorothy knew, but Dorothy was 2 days away, an eternity. "I don't care what she suspects," he snarled, shaking me slightly. "From now on, you do what I say, and right now, we are going downstairs. We have a project to begin." He started dragging me towards the basement door again. But this time, something inside me was different. Before, there had only been terror. Now, mixed with the terror, was a tiny, flickering ember of hope. Dorothy knew. She was my witness. She was my lifeline. I had to survive for 2 days. 2 days, and help might come. As he forced open the heavy door and pushed me towards the dark, musty-smelling staircase, I held on to that thought like a prayer. I was descending into hell, but for the first time, I knew someone on the outside knew I was gone. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a deafening clang of finality. It wasn't the familiar, comforting click of a wooden door closing in our home. It was the sound of a tomb being sealed. I heard the slide of heavy bolts, the groan of metal on metal, and then the solid, definitive turn of the wheel lock. And then, nothing. Silence. A silence so total and profound it was a physical presence. It pressed in on my eardrums, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The soundproofing was perfect. My own frantic breathing, the wild thumping of my heart against my ribs, were thunderous in the absolute stillness. I was cut off from the world. A scream would die in this room. A cry for help would be swallowed by these thick, padded walls. The hope that Dorothy had given me felt 1,000,000 miles away. 2 days. How could I possibly survive for 2 days in this box? I stumbled in the pitch-black darkness, my hands outstretched, until my fingers brushed against the coarse fabric of the thin mattress on the floor. I sank down onto it, curling into a tight ball, trying to make myself as small as possible, as if I could simply disappear. The air was cold and carried the same strange mix of odors, fresh pine, varnish, and that sharp chemical undertone that made my stomach clench. This was real. This was happening. My husband, the man I had promised to love and honor, had built a cage for me, and now he had locked me inside. I don't know how long I lay there, minutes or hours. Time ceased to have meaning in the disorienting dark. My panic eventually subsided, leaving behind a cold, hollow terror. I thought about the notebook, about the drawings of straps and hooks, about his chilling words. Isabel will be perfect after the lessons. The lessons. When would the first one begin? The answer came sooner than I could have prepared for. I heard the sound of the lock being undone, a slow, deliberate process that sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. The heavy door swung inward, flooding the room with the dim, naked light from the single bulb in the cellar. Paul stood in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the light. He was holding something in his hand. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't lock it this time. He didn't need to. There was nowhere for me to run. My eyes adjusted to the weak light, and I saw what he was holding. It was a thick leather strap, the kind a barber uses to sharpen a straight razor. "Get up," he said. His voice was calm, devoid of the rage from before. It was a flat, clinical tone that was somehow far more terrifying. I scrambled to my feet, pressing myself back against the padded wall. "Paul, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Don't do this. We can talk. Whatever is wrong, we can fix it." "There is nothing to fix," he said, taking a step closer. "There is only something to correct. You have been disobedient, Isabel. You lied to me. You tried to defy me in front of a neighbor. A wife does not defy her husband." He smiled, but it was a cold, empty thing. My father knew how to handle a defiant wife. He taught my mother her place. It was his duty. And now, it is my duty to teach you yours. He talked about his father, a man I had never met, a man Paul had never spoken of. He described a childhood of brutal, rigid discipline, where fear was mistaken for respect and obedience was beaten into every member of the family. He spoke of it not with sadness or anger, but with a strange, twisted reverence. He wasn't a monster who had appeared out of nowhere. He was a monster who had been raised by one, a man meticulously shaped by another's cruelty, convinced that this was the natural order of things. He saw this not as abuse, but as a necessary, almost loving act of correction. I will not describe what happened next. Not in detail. The physical pain, as sharp and terrible as it was nothing compared to the complete and utter demolition of my spirit. It was the humiliation, It was the betrayal. It was the soul-crushing realization that the man I had shared my home, my life, and my heart with had never existed. He was a ghost, a fiction. The reality was this cold-eyed stranger who believed he was entitled to my pain. When he was finished, he dropped the strap onto the workbench and looked down at me where I lay weeping on the mattress. "This is just the first lesson," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "There will be others, as many as it takes, until you learn." He turned and walked out, closing the heavy door, the sound of the lock turning once again sealing me in my silent, dark prison. I lay there, every part of my body screaming in protest, and I was consumed by a despair so profound I thought it would swallow me whole. I was trapped. No one in the world knew where I was. No one could hear my cries. No one. Except Dorothy. The thought of her name was a tiny flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. She was expecting me. In 2 days. If I didn't show up, she would know something was wrong. She would do something. She had to. But 2 days was an eternity. Looking at the heavy strap lying on the workbench, I knew I might not survive 2 days of Paul's lessons. I couldn't just wait to be rescued. I had to get out myself. I had to find a way. A new feeling began to stir beneath the pain and the fear. It was anger. A hot, cleansing rage that burned away my tears. He would not break me. I would not become the meek, obedient creature he wanted to sculpt through pain. I would survive. I would escape. And somehow, someday, I would make him pay. Fueled by this newfound determination, I forced my aching body to move. I pushed myself up and began to explore my prison with a new, desperate focus. I ran my hands over every inch of the padded walls. They were thick, solid. I examined the door again, a solid slab of steel. No handle on the inside, no hinges visible. It was built to contain, to hold. But Paul, for all his meticulous planning, had made one mistake. He was human. He had to breathe. I looked up, my eyes straining in the dim light that now seemed to be permanently on. And there it was, the one imperfection in his perfect box, the one thing that connected this room to the outside world, the small circular ventilation duct near the ceiling. It was my only hope. But how could I reach it? It was a good 2 feet above my head. I looked around the small room. The mattress, the bucket he had left for me in the corner. It wasn't much. I dragged the mattress across the floor and pushed it against the wall directly beneath the vent. I climbed on top of it, my body protesting with every movement. I stood on my toes and reached, my fingers just brushing the cold metal of the grill. Not high enough. I looked at the plastic bucket. It was flimsy, but it might just work. I turned it upside down and carefully placed it on the center of the mattress. It wobbled precariously. Holding my breath, I stepped onto it, using the wall to steady myself. The plastic groaned under my weight, but it held. I reached up again. This time, I could get my fingers around the edges of the grill. I pulled, but it was screwed tightly into the ceiling. It wouldn't budge. I needed a tool. I stepped down from my unstable perch and began to search the room again, this time with a specific purpose. I ran my fingers along the seams where the walls met the floor. Paul was a master craftsman, but he had built this room in a hurry, fueled by his obsession. Surely he had made a mistake, dropped something, overlooked some small detail. My fingers brushed against something hard and sharp, wedged deep in the crack between the wooden floor of the box and the concrete of the cellar beneath it. I dug at it with my fingernails until my fingers were raw, but I finally managed to work it free. I held it up to the dim light. It was a long, thick nail, at least 4 inches long, that must have fallen during construction. It felt heavy and solid in my hand. It was my key. It was my weapon. I waited, listening for any sound of Paul's return. The house above was silent. I climbed back onto the bucket, the nail clutched in my hand. It was clumsy work. The nail was a poor substitute for a screwdriver, and I had to hold my arms above my head, which quickly made them ache with a burning fatigue. But I worked with a frantic, desperate energy. I wedged the point of the nail into the slot of one of the screws and began to turn, a fraction of an inch at a time. My muscles screamed, sweat dripped into my eyes, but I didn't stop. Finally, I felt one screw give, then another. After what felt like hours of torturous effort, the grill came loose in my hands. I almost dropped it, catching it just in time. The last thing I needed was the sound of it clattering to the floor. I carefully lowered it and slid it under the mattress. A current of cool, musty air flowed from the now open duct, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, the faint, sweet smell of freedom. I stuck my arm into the opening as far as I could. The duct was narrow, but I could feel that it was smooth metal. It seemed just wide enough for me to squeeze through if I could somehow pull myself up. It was a terrifying thought, wriggling through a dark, narrow tube, not knowing where it led or if I might get stuck. But it was better than staying here. Just as a sliver of real hope began to warm my chest, I heard it. The sound of the lock. He was coming back. In a mad scramble, I jumped down, shoved the bucket back in the corner, and laid the grill back over the opening, propping it in place. It wasn't perfect, but in the dim light, it might pass a casual inspection. I threw myself onto the mattress, closed my eyes, and forced my breathing to become slow and even, feigning sleep just as the heavy door swung open. Paul entered carrying a tray. The smell of warm soup filled the room. "Wake up," he said. His voice was soft, almost gentle. It made my skin crawl. "I brought you some dinner." I opened my eyes slowly, trying to look weak and defeated. It wasn't difficult. I sat up as he placed the tray on the workbench. It held a bowl of vegetable soup, a piece of bread, and a glass of water. "Eat," he ordered, pulling up the single wooden stool and sitting down to watch me. I moved to the bench and picked up the spoon. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to eat. The soup was hot, and I was starving. I focused on the food, avoiding his gaze, feeling his eyes on me with every spoonful. "You see?" he said after a few moments of silence, his voice laced with a twisted sort of kindness. "I take care of you. I give you food and shelter. All I ask in return is your obedience, your respect. It's not so much to ask, is it, Isabel?" I didn't answer. I just kept eating. "I don't want to hurt you," he continued, and he sounded almost sad. "But a man has to have discipline in his own home. It's for your own good, to make you better. You'll understand that in time." I lifted my eyes and looked at him then. He truly believed it. In the depths of his warped mind, he was not a monster. He was a teacher, a savior. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. "I'll leave you to think about what you've learned today," he said, standing up. He took the empty tray and walked to the door. "Good night, Isabel." The door boomed shut, the lock turned, and I was alone again. I waited until I was sure he was gone, and then I went back to the vent. My first plan, to climb through, now seemed impossible. It was too high, and I didn't have the strength to pull myself up. But as I stood on the bucket, feeling the faint draft on my face, another idea began to form. An idea born from a memory of my father teaching me how to burn damp leaves in the yard. "They won't make much flame," he had said, "but they'll make a whole lot of smoke." Smoke. The ventilation duct was designed to pull stale air out of the room. But what if I reversed the process? What if I introduced something into the duct? The plan solidified in my mind, a desperate, dangerous gamble. I wouldn't try to escape through the vent. I would use the vent to force him to let me out. If I could start a small, smoky fire at the entrance of the duct, the ventilation system would suck the smoke into the rest of the house. It would fill the cellar, seep upstairs. It would have to. It was a crazy, reckless plan. 1,000 things could go wrong. The most glaring problem was that I had no way to start a fire. Paul was meticulous. He wouldn't have left matches or a lighter. I searched the room again, my eyes darting everywhere. And then I saw it. The thing I had noticed yesterday but dismissed. The new electrical outlet he had installed on the wall near the workbench, no doubt for his terrible tools. Electricity. An outlet could make a spark. I needed something metal to create a short circuit, something small I could control. My hands flew to my hair. I always wore 2 small metal bobby pins to keep my bangs out of my eyes. I pulled them free. They were flimsy, but they were metal. They would have to work. For tinder, I tore a long, thin strip from the rough linen lining of the mattress. For fuel, I gathered the dust and sawdust from the corners of the room. It wasn't much, but I hoped it would be enough to create a thick, acrid smoke. I was ready. I knew the risks. I could electrocute myself. I could misjudge the fire and burn alive in this soundproof box. But the alternative, to sit here and wait for his next lesson, was a certainty I could not face. This was my only chance. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I climbed onto my precarious perch, 1 bobby pin in each hand. I carefully inserted the end of 1 pin into one of the slots in the outlet. Then, holding the other pin by its coated end, I moved it towards the second slot. This was it. I closed my eyes and jammed it in. There was a brilliant blue-white flash, a loud pop, and a shower of sparks. A jolt shot up my arm, making me cry out, but I didn't let go. A tiny, miraculous flame sputtered to life on the end of the molten bobby pin. Before it could die, I thrust it against the strip of mattress lining I had wedged into the opening of the vent. The fabric smoldered, then caught, just as I'd hoped. It wasn't a large flame, but a slow, steady burn that began to produce a thick, grayish smoke. I watched, my heart soaring with a wild, triumphant hope as the smoke began to curl, and then my hope turned to ash in my mouth. The smoke wasn't being sucked out of the room. The draft had changed. The smoke was pouring into my prison, a stupid, fatal oversight. The airflow could change depending on the wind, the pressure, a dozen things I didn't understand. And today, fate had decided the air would flow in, not out. My clever escape plan had become a self-inflicted execution. I jumped down, coughing, my eyes starting to water. The small room was filling with smoke at an alarming rate. I had to put it out. I grabbed the bucket, but it was empty. I scrambled back up on the mattress, trying to beat out the smoldering fabric with my bare hands, but it was too hot, the smoke too thick. I fell to the floor, crawling to the crack under the door, gasping for the thin ribbon of fresh air there. My lungs burned, my vision blurred. Panic, absolute and suffocating, took over. I was going to die. I was going to choke to death in the very trap I had set to free myself. And then, through the ringing in my ears and my own ragged coughing, I heard a new sound. It was faint at first, then grew louder, a high-pitched, piercing shriek coming from somewhere upstairs in the house. A fire alarm. I didn't even know we had one. Seconds later, I heard another sound that made my blood run cold. Heavy footsteps pounding down the cellar stairs. The frantic metallic sound of the wheel lock being spun, the bolts being thrown. The door burst open, and through the haze of smoke, I saw Paul's shape in the doorway, his arm thrown over his face. He stared into the smoke-filled room, his eyes wild with disbelief and fury. This was not the salvation I had prayed for. This was the wrath of the God of this tiny man-made hell. He was here, and I had nowhere left to run. The door of my prison burst open, and for a heart-stopping moment, all I could see was Paul's silhouette framed against the cellar light, a dark angel of wrath emerging from the haze. The fire alarm upstairs was still shrieking, an insistent, mechanical scream that was no match for the fury in his eyes. "What in God's name have you done?" he roared, his voice cutting through the smoke. He wasn't seeing a terrified wife gasping for air. He was seeing a saboteur who had attacked his sanctuary. He plunged into the room, his first instinct not to help me, but to save his creation. He grabbed the thick wool blanket from the mattress and used it to smother the smoldering fabric inside the vent, beating at it with a frantic energy until the last wisp of smoke ceased to rise. The immediate source of the smoke was gone, but the room was still thick with it, the air still unbreathable. He turned to me then, his face a mask of demonic rage. "Were you trying to burn the house down? To kill us both?" I couldn't answer. I was on my hands and knees, overcome by a violent fit of coughing, each ragged gasp pulling more of the acrid smoke into my burning lungs. He didn't offer a hand. He grabbed a fistful of my hair and hauled me to my feet with a single brutal motion. "Answer me!" he screamed, his face inches from mine. I couldn't breathe. I choked out between coughs. "You think this is a game?" he snarled, dragging me out of the soundproof room and into the cellar. He didn't stop there. He pulled me up the narrow wooden stairs, his grip relentless. The cleaner air on the ground floor was a relief, but it only allowed me to feel the full force of his rage. He continued to drag me through the kitchen, past the table where Dorothy's untouched peach pie sat like a relic from another lifetime. The fire alarm continued its deafening wail. "We have to get out," he muttered, more to himself than to me, his eyes darting around at the haze of smoke now filling our home. He yanked open the front door and shoved me out onto the lawn. I fell to my knees on the cool, damp grass, the bright afternoon sun blinding me after the perpetual twilight of the basement. I took in huge, shuddering gulps of fresh, clean air, the sweet scent of cut grass, a shocking contrast to the chemical stench of my prison. But my relief was short-lived. Paul stood over me, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling with a rage that seemed to radiate from him like heat. "I gave you a chance," he said, his voice a low, shaking hiss. "I was going to be lenient. I was even going to let you come back upstairs tonight. But you chose this. You chose to destroy everything." The injustice of his words, the sheer insane delusion of them, snapped something inside me. My fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but for the first time it was eclipsed by my anger. "I destroyed everything?" I cried, pushing myself up, my voice raw and scratchy. "You built a prison for me, Paul. You locked me in a cage. This isn't a marriage, it's madness." "Madness is disobeying your husband," he roared, advancing on me. "Madness is trying to burn down the home he provides for you. Madness is not being grateful for the lessons he is trying to teach you." I scrambled backwards on the grass, trying to get away, but he was too fast. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in, and started to pull me back towards the house. "Now you're coming back inside," he snarled, "and we are going to finish your lesson, once and for all." "No!" I shrieked, finding a strength in my lungs I didn't know I possessed. I twisted in his grip, my one free hand flailing, and I screamed with everything I had. "Help! Somebody, please, help me!" His hand flew out and slapped me across the face, the crack of the impact sharp and ugly in the quiet afternoon air. "Shut up! Who do you think is going to hear you out here?" "I don't think that will be necessary, Paul." The voice was calm, firm, and came from behind us. We both froze and turned. Dorothy was standing at the edge of our driveway, her hands calmly clasped in front of her, and she was not alone. Standing beside her was a tall, broad-shouldered man I'd never seen before. He was younger, perhaps in his 30s, and stood with a quiet solidity that was incredibly intimidating. Paul's transformation was instantaneous and sickening to watch. The snarling monster vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by a frantic, concerned husband. He let go of my arm and rushed to my side, trying to help me up, his touch now a grotesque pantomime of care. "Dorothy, thank God you're here," he said, his voice filled with a fake, breathless panic. "It's Isabel. She's had some kind of episode, a breakdown. She started a fire in the basement. She's not herself. She's been saying the most awful, crazy things. Dorothy's expression remained perfectly calm. Her sharp eyes moved from Paul's frantic face to mine, taking in the terror, the fresh red mark on my cheek that mirrored the one from yesterday. She didn't believe a word he was saying. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, her voice dripping with a sympathy that was clearly for me. She then gestured to the man beside her. "Paul, I'm sorry to intrude like this. This is my nephew Thomas. He's just in from out of town for a visit. He was a soldier," she added, a subtle but clear warning. Paul nodded at Thomas, his eyes wary. "A pleasure." Dorothy then executed the most brilliant piece of acting I have ever witnessed. She put a hand to her forehead as if she just remembered something. "Oh my goodness, what a coincidence. On my way over, I bumped into your cousin at the market. Gary, was it? He said he was driving out here to surprise you. He should be here any minute now." Paul stared at her, completely bewildered. "My cousin? Gary? Dorothy, I don't have a cousin named Gary." In that exact moment of his confusion, a car turned into our driveway and started rolling slowly towards the house. It was a simple, plain car, and behind the wheel was a man he didn't know. But the timing was so perfect, so utterly unbelievable, that Paul was completely thrown off balance. His mind was racing, trying to process the fire alarm, Dorothy's sudden appearance with a soldier nephew, and now a mysterious cousin who didn't exist. He turned his full attention to the approaching car, his guard dropping for one crucial second. It was the only opening I would get. It was now or never. While his eyes were on the car, I scrambled to my feet. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted across the lawn, towards the road, towards the slim, impossible chance of freedom. I heard Paul scream my name, a sound of pure, frustrated rage. I heard his heavy footsteps pounding on the grass behind me, closing the distance. But then I heard other sounds. A grunt, the thud of bodies colliding, a shouted curse. Thomas had done his part. He had intercepted Paul, buying me precious seconds. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I flew down the gravel driveway, my bare feet screaming in protest against the sharp stones, my lungs burning, the fire alarm at the house a fading siren song of my escape. I reached the paved county road and didn't stop, running blindly, tears and sweat mixing on my face. A minute later, I heard the rumble of an engine. My heart seized with terror, thinking it was Paul. But it was an old, beat-up pickup truck coming from the other direction. Without thinking, I ran into the middle of the road and waved my arms frantically. The truck slowed to a halt, and an old farmer with a kind, weathered face peered out at me from under the brim of a straw hat. "Good Lord, miss, are you all right?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. I couldn't speak, only shake my head and gasp for breath. "Get in," he said, pushing the passenger door open from the inside. "Just get in. I'll take you wherever you need to go." I scrambled into the cab, the vinyl seat hot from the sun, and slammed the door shut. "The sheriff," I choked out. "Please, take me to the sheriff's office." The farmer didn't ask any questions. He just nodded grimly, put the truck in gear, and drove. The ride into town was a blur. I stared out the window at the familiar fields and farmhouses, but I saw none of it. All I could see was the notebook, the leather strap, the cold look in Paul's eyes. When we arrived at the small brick building that housed the sheriff's office, the farmer insisted on walking me inside. The deputy at the front desk looked up, his expression shifting from boredom to alarm as he took in my appearance. My torn dress, my bare, dirty feet, the marks on my face and arms. "I need help," I sobbed, and then the dam broke. The terror and pain and horror of the last few days came pouring out of me in a torrent of words. I told him everything, about the changes in Paul, the soundproof room, the notebook, the lessons, the fire, Dorothy and Thomas. I told my story, and for the first time I saw not disbelief or judgment in someone's eyes, but deep, professional concern. He listened, he took notes, and most importantly, he believed me. They brought me a glass of water and a blanket. They told me a patrol car was already on its way to my house and that an alert for Paul and his vehicle had been sent out across the county. An officer then drove me to the small local hospital where a kind doctor examined me, her touch gentle, her questions soft. She documented every bruise, every mark, creating an official record of Paul's cruelty. I was sitting on the edge of a hospital bed, wrapped in a clean gown, when the sheriff himself walked in. His face was grave. "Ma'am," he said, holding his hat in his hands, "I have some news. It's good and it's bad." I held my breath. "The good news is, we found the room in your basement. It was exactly as you described it. We also found a workbench, tools, and a leather strap," he said, his voice tight with disgust. "And we found the notebook in the bedside table. It's all here. We have everything we need to put him away for a very long time." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me sick washed over me. It was real. I wasn't crazy. "And the bad news?" I whispered. The sheriff sighed, his expression grim. "When my deputies arrived at the house, it was empty. The fire alarm was still going off, and there were clear signs of a struggle on the front lawn. But there was no sign of your husband, Paul, or of your neighbor's nephew, Thomas. He's vanished too. As of right now, your husband is in the wind. We don't know where he is." The relief I had felt just moments before evaporated, replaced by the familiar cold dread. I was safe, for now. The world knew the truth. But my monster was still out there, and he was free. I spent the next week in that quiet, sterile hospital room, a strange sort of sanctuary after the horrors of the basement. The sheriff placed a deputy outside my door around the clock, a constant, reassuring presence. Physically, I was healing. The bruises were fading from purple to a sickly yellow-green, and the doctors said the smoke had done no permanent damage to my lungs. But my soul felt bruised in a way no medicine could touch. The news that Paul was a fugitive had planted a seed of terror deep inside me. Every time the door to my room opened, my heart would leap into my throat. I'd see his face in shadows, hear his voice in the whisper of the air conditioning. He was gone, but he was everywhere. On the third day, Dorothy and Thomas came to visit. Thomas had a dark bruise high on his cheekbone, and his knuckles were scraped, grim evidence of his struggle with Paul. "I'm so sorry, Isabel," he said, his voice full of a guilt that was entirely undeserved. "I tried to hold him, I really did, but he was like a wild animal. I've been in combat, and I've never seen a rage like that in a man's eyes. He broke free and got to his car before I could stop him. I'm so sorry I let him get away." "Thomas, don't you ever say that," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I reached out and took his hand. "You didn't let him get away. You let me get away. You stood between me and him. You saved my life. I will never, ever be able to thank you enough for that." Dorothy, ever practical, got straight to the point. "We need to figure out where you're going to go when they let you out of here, dear. You can't go back to that house." The thought of the house, our house, made me feel physically ill. It was no longer a home. It was a crime scene, a monument to a monstrous secret. "And I can't go to my parents," I added quietly. "They wouldn't understand." "You can come and stay with me, of course," Dorothy offered immediately. "I don't think that's a good idea, Aunt Dorothy," Thomas said gently. "Paul knows where you live. It would be the first place he'd think to look. It's not safe for either of you." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. I was a refugee, a woman with nowhere to go. "I have another idea," Thomas said after a moment. "I have a small apartment in the city. I bought it as an investment a few years back, but it's sitting empty right now. It's in a secure building, and no one there knows me, let alone you. You could stay there, Isabel, for as long as you need. No one would ever think to look for you there." I stared at him, overwhelmed by the generosity of this man who, just days ago, had been a complete stranger. "I couldn't possibly accept," I started to say, but he held up a hand. "Please, insist," he said, a kind but firm look in his eyes. "Consider it a small way for me to make up for the fact that your husband is still out there. It would help me sleep better at night, knowing you're safe." And so, a week after my escape, Thomas drove me from our small town to the bustling, anonymous city. The apartment was simple but clean, a small haven of peace high above the noisy streets. For the first time in a very long time, I locked a door and felt safe. The weeks that followed were the hardest. I was free, but my mind was still a prison. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the sound of the hammer, 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 heavy blows echoing in my silent apartment. I was terrified of every knock on the door, every footstep in the hallway. But slowly, with the patient support of Dorothy, who called me every single day, and Thomas, who would stop by with groceries and a quiet, reassuring presence, I began to breathe again. About a month after I'd moved to the city, the sheriff came to see me. He had news. They had found Paul. He'd made it 2 states away and was trying to cross the border. When local police had tried to pull him over, he'd led them on a high-speed chase down a treacherous mountain road. He had lost control. The car had gone off an embankment. "Is he dead?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "No," the sheriff said, "but he's badly broken. He's in a hospital, in a coma. The doctors say it's very unlikely he'll ever wake up." I sat with that news, a strange cocktail of emotions swirling inside me. It wasn't the triumphant joy of justice I might have expected. It was a quiet, profound relief. The monster was caged, not by bars of steel, but by the prison of his own broken body. He could never hurt me or anyone else, ever again. Before he left, the sheriff handed me a small folded brochure. "Something else," he said. "There's an organization in the city here that helps women in your situation. They heard a sanitized version of your story and asked me to pass this along. Only if you're interested, of course." The brochure was for a place called Aurora House, a shelter for battered women. I thanked him and put it on my kitchen table, where it sat for 2 weeks, untouched. I wasn't ready, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Finally, one morning, I picked up the phone. At Aurora House, I found my purpose. I started as a volunteer, answering phones, sorting donated clothes, making coffee. But mostly, I listened. I listened to women who had just escaped their own private hells, their stories all so different and yet all so terribly the same. They were stories of fear, control, and isolation. In their eyes, I saw my own terror reflected back at me, and in sharing my own story, in telling them, "I know, I understand, and I promise you, it gets better," I felt my own broken pieces begin to knit themselves back together. Helping them heal was helping me heal myself. 3 months after I started volunteering, the sheriff called. Paul had passed away in the night, having never woken from his coma. It was truly over. The final chapter of that terrible story was written. In the same call, he informed me of a legal reality I hadn't considered. As Paul had no will and no other living relatives, our house, his workshop, everything now legally belonged to me. The thought of owning that place, of being tied to it, was horrifying. In a symbolic act of liberation, I had the property sold as quickly as the law would allow. I never saw the money. I signed it all over, every last penny, to Aurora House, to help them build a new wing so they could offer sanctuary to more women. I transformed the place of my imprisonment into a foundation of freedom for others. The years went by. I eventually took a position as a full-time counselor at the center. I found a calling I never knew I had, My life was full, it was meaningful, but it was solitary. I had accepted that love and marriage were a part of a past life I could never return to. And then I met Walter. He was a retired history professor who had started volunteering at Aurora House, helping the women with legal paperwork and tutoring their children. He was quiet, gentle, and had the kindest eyes I had ever seen. His hands were the hands of a scholar, soft and used to holding nothing heavier than a book. Our love story was not a whirlwind romance. It was a slow, cautious bloom. And friendship that deepened over 2 years of shared cups of coffee, long talks, and mutual respect. He was patient. He never pushed. He let me set the pace, understanding the fragile trust of a heart that had been so brutally broken. He taught me, day by day, that real love is not about possession or control, but about freedom and partnership. When I finally accepted his proposal, we were married in a small, simple ceremony in the garden of Aurora House. Dorothy, then in her 90s, her eyes as sharp as ever, stood by my side as my witness. "I am so happy for you, Isabel," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "You've finally found the peace you deserve." And she was right. The years I had with Walter were a gift. They were years of quiet joy, of shared laughter, of a deep, abiding love that healed the last of my hidden wounds. He passed away 5 years ago, and I miss him every day, but the love he gave me still warms my heart. Now, at 83, I look back on that terrified young woman trapped in a soundproof room, and she seems like a stranger from a distant past. That terrible experience forged me, but it did not define me. The sound of that hammer, 3 quick taps, a pause, 2 heavy blows, no longer brings terror. Now, when I hear it in my memory, it is a reminder. It is a reminder of the strength I found in the depths of despair, of the resilience of the human spirit, and of the profound truth that even after the most devastating fire, new life can and will grow from the ashes. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows? Maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.